I was the one who found the ledgers, so I am the one who has to tell it. For 11 years I worked the analysis decks of the survey ship Ataris, a long gray vessel with too many empty corridors, reading the traffic of species that did not know we were listening. I was a signals analyst before that title meant anything grand. I sorted noise. I found patterns in the noise. I built the shapes of foreign grammars out of intercepted bursts and handed them up the chain to people who decided what the shapes meant. It was quiet work. I was good at it because I did not need it to be more than it was. A man who wants his work to be heroic will lie to himself about what he is looking at. I never wanted that. I wanted the numbers to be true. The Vash ordinate came into our records the way a cold comes into a house, through a gap no one had thought to close. We had cataloged them years earlier as a mid-tier caste empire out along the Sable Verge, a cluster of predatory worlds that kept to themselves and traded in nothing we wanted. They were not warlike in the way we understood war. They did not mass fleets at borders or broadcast ultimatums. They were patient, incurious, and entirely certain of their place above every other living thing. We filed them and moved on. There were louder threats. There always are. Meridian Reach had gone silent 9 years before I ever decoded a single Vash word. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only honest thing I have left. Meridian Reach was a human colony on the far edge of the Verge, a farming and refinery world of 240,000 people. It was not a military outpost. It had no fleet worth the name, 2 customs cutters and a hospital ship, the St. Alder, that ran the long circuit between Meridian and the nearer colonies carrying people who needed care the frontier could not give them. I had never been there, but I had read its traffic once, years before, in the ordinary course of my work, the dull, cheerful signal of a frontier world going about its life. Harvest reports, a dispute over water rights that went to arbitration and back. A message traffic thick with the small business of people who intended to be somewhere a long time, shipping schedules, a school being built, a request up the line for a second physician because the St. Alder could not always be in port when a child took ill. I had filed all of it under nothing, because it was nothing, because it was only a colony being a colony. I did not know then that I was reading the last ordinary days of 240,000 people. You never do. That is the thing about the ordinary. It does not announce itself as precious until it is gone. Meridian went dark in a season of bad storms and worse communications relays, and the loss was logged as a catastrophe of the ordinary kind. A relay failure. A colony beyond reach. When the silence held past the storms, a cutter was sent, and found the relays down and the approaches fouled with debris consistent with a bad orbital season, and reported the colony lost. And there was nothing in what the cutter found to contradict that, because the Vash had arranged for there to be nothing. They had left us a story we would believe. They had studied us well enough to know what a lost frontier colony was supposed to look like, and they had made Meridian Reach look like that, and then they had walled it off behind the fouled approaches and gone quietly to work. We mourned it the way you mourn a town swept off a coast. We assumed the sea had taken them. We held services. We carved the number into a wall on Earth, and we told ourselves the frontier was cruel and moved the survey lanes elsewhere. We were wrong about how they died. That is the whole of it. We were wrong about how they died, and I am the man who learned the truth, and the truth was worse than any storm. It came to me as accounting. The Vash, whatever else they were, kept records. Meticulous, layered, obsessive records. The way a certain kind of mind keeps records when it has decided that the universe is inventory, and it is the one holding the ledger. We had pulled a compressed archive out of a derelict Vash tender we found drifting near the Verge, its crew long dead of some internal failure, its cores still warm enough to read. Most of it was cargo manifests and route logs, the dull circulatory system of any empire. I was assigned to it because I was cheap to assign, and because no one expected it to matter. It took me 4 months to break the structure of their notation. Their numbers were not our numbers. They counted in nested cycles, and their units of quantity changed depending on what was being counted, one system for minerals, another for machine parts, another for what they classed as provisioning. I remember the particular tedium of those first weeks, the way I remember the tedium of anything that turned out to matter. I built a concordance the slow way, aligning route logs against known star positions, until the place names in their notation lensed into worlds I could point to on a chart. I cross-checked their cargo units against masses we could verify from the derelict tender's own hull tolerances. It was the kind of work no one thanks you for, the kind that produces nothing for weeks and then produces everything at once. And I did it in the long gray quiet of the analysis deck, with the ship's air recyclers ticking over and the frontier turning slowly outside the ports. That last category snagged me, provisioning. It appeared constantly, threaded through the route logs, always attached to specific worlds and specific quantities and a schedule. A very regular schedule. At first I assumed it was foodstuffs, the ordinary logistics of feeding an empire's own people, and I nearly filed it under the dull heading of quartermastering and moved on. But the quantities were wrong for grain or livestock in any sense I understood, and the schedule was wrong, tuned too finely, adjusted too often. Provisioning drawn on a cycle, world by world, the quantities rising and falling in a rhythm I could not place. I spent a full week convinced I had mistranslated a unit. I had not. When I finally mapped the schedule against biology, against the rate at which a living body regenerates the specific substances that were being drawn, the rhythm resolved into something I understood and wished I did not. I was looking at a harvest calendar tuned to how fast a body replaces what is taken from it. Provisioning, yield, cycle, replacement rate. I found meridian reach in the ledger on a gray afternoon, with a cup of cold tea going colder at my elbow, and I have not been entirely warm since. The colony was not listed as lost. It was listed as a provisioning holding, registered 9 years earlier under a VASH administrative seal, catalogued, assessed, and assigned an intake schedule. 240,000 people entered as a herd, not attacked, not conquered in any sense that ended in a battle. Taken quietly, its 2 cutters and its hospital ship neutralized in a single night by a force that had studied the colony's defenses the way a man studies a lock, and then held. Held and worked. The VASH had not destroyed Meridian Reach. They had kept it. They had walled it, seeded it with their apparatus, and drawn from it on a schedule for 9 years marrow, plasma, living tissue, the specific substances their caste required and could not synthesize, and had decided, somewhere in the long arrogance of their history, they were entitled to take from the living bodies of lesser things. The ledger recorded the intake in cold, rising columns. It recorded the replacement rate, how long a body needed between drawings to be worth drawing from again. It recorded losses, which is the word they used for the people who did not survive the schedule, and it recorded the adjustment of the intake to keep the losses within an acceptable band, because a herd worked 2 hard stops producing, and the VASH were nothing if not efficient. They had kept 240,000 human beings alive for 9 years for the specific purpose of bleeding them, and they had managed the operation with the unbothered competence of men, balancing a granary against a winter. I read it 3 times. I checked my grammar. I checked my units. I wanted to be wrong the way I have never wanted anything. I ran the intake columns twice more against the replacement trait model, hoping some error in my own concordance had manufactured a horror that was not there, and each time the model held and the horror held with it. There is a particular loneliness in being the only person in the universe who knows a thing, and knowing that the thing is true, and knowing that in a few hours you are going to make other people know it too. I sat with that loneliness through the back half of a shift. Then I brought it to my section chief, a hard, quiet woman named Idris Solveig, who had been reading terrible things off foreign cores for longer than I had been alive. She read it at her own console with the door shut. I stood because there was nowhere to sit and because I could not have sat. I watched the reading change her face by degrees, not shock. She was long past shock, but something slower and heavier settling into the lines of it, the look of a person recognizing a shape they had hoped never to see again. She reached the replacement traits section and stopped and went back and read it a second time the way I had, and I understood that she was doing exactly what I had done, looking for the error that would let her off. There was no error. At the end she sat very still for a long time, long enough that the deck lights cycled and the quiet became its own presence in the room, and then she said, "Corwin, take it up. Take it all the way up. Do not let anyone shorten it. The instant a thing like this gets shortened, it gets survivable, and this must not be allowed to become survivable." She looked at me then properly, the way she rarely did. "You did good work," she said. "I am sorry it was this." I did not sleep that night. I have not slept well since. But I did the work. I built the case the way you build any case that has to survive contact with people who would rather it were not true, clean, sourced, redundant, every claim tied to a line in their own ledger so that no one could tell me I had imagined it. I laid the Vash notation beside my concordance, beside the verified worlds, beside the biology, so that a reader who trusted none of it could rebuild the conclusion from the ground up and arrive where I had arrived. I did not editorialize. I did not need to. The Vash had editorialized for me, in their own hand, 9 years of it, and all I had to do was translate. The hardest hours were not the technical ones. The hardest hours were the ones spent turning the intake columns back into people, reminding myself, against the anesthetic pull of the notation, that every rising number was a body, that the losses were not a variable but a grave, that the adjustment to keep the losses within an acceptable band was a decision made by a mind that had weighed the death of human beings against the efficiency of a schedule and chosen the schedule. The Vash had built a language in which none of that had to be felt. My job, I decided, was to build a dossier in which all of it had to be. The dossier went up the chain and out of my hands, and I assumed, as you do, that it would disappear into the machinery of committees and caution. Frontier colonies had been lost before. Terrible things had been done to human beings before, out in the dark, by things that did not think of us as people. The galaxy was large and cruel, and Earth was one voice in it. And the honest expectation of any analyst who has watched the machinery long enough is that the machinery will do what it always does, which is to note the outrage, express regret, and find that the moment for a response has already passed. That is not what happened. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why Meridian Reach was different. It was not the number. We had lost larger colonies. It was not the distance or the strategic value. Meridian Reach had none. I have come to believe it was the ledger itself. It is one thing to be attacked. Attack is an act of the moment, a thing done in heat, and even the worst of it carries some shape a human mind can hold: anger, fear, the ugly logic of a fight. It is another thing entirely to be filed. To learn that your people were not killed but kept, that their suffering was scheduled, that somewhere a clerk of an alien caste sat with your colony's name in a column and adjusted the intake to optimize yield, and felt nothing, because the feeling of nothing was the whole point, because to feel something would have meant admitting we were not livestock. The Vash did not hate us. That was the thing the ledger made unbearable. Hate would have been a kind of recognition. They kept us the way we keep grain. Earth read the ledger. And Earth, which had spent a long age learning to be patient, learning to negotiate, learning to swallow the frontier's cruelties because the alternative was a war it did not want, Earth stopped being patient. There was no declaration. I want that understood, because people who were not there imagine trumpets, imagine a speech, imagine a leader with a raised fist. There was none of that. What there was instead was a document. It came down the chain 3 weeks after my dossier went up, and it was not addressed to the Vash, because you do not address a directive to livestock, and the Vash had taught us, in their own ledger, exactly what it means to be addressed by something that considers you beneath address. The document was addressed to us, to the fleet. It was called the Culling Order, and it was the coldest thing I have ever read, and I have read a Vash harvest calendar cover to cover. The culling order did not speak of vengeance. It did not speak of justice, even. It spoke of accounting. It observed, in language as flat and layered as the Vash's own, that the Vash ordinate had entered a human population into their inventory and drawn from it for 9 years, and that this had created, in the plainest terms the order could find, a debt. It set out the terms of settlement. It did not ask for the return of Meridian Reach, because there was nothing left of Meridian Reach to return. The intake had continued to within a season of my decoding it, and a herd worked for 9 years to the edge of its replacement rate does not have survivors so much as remnants. It did not ask for reparation, because there is no currency in which a body can be repaid. It set out instead the only settlement the arithmetic allowed. The Vash had built their existence on the assumption that they could feed on the living and pay no price, and Earth would demonstrate, world by world, ledger against ledger, that the assumption was false. Every feeding world the Vash owned would be emptied of its apparatus and its caste and its capacity to ever do this again. Not destroyed in fire. Emptied. Closed. The way you close an account. I was named in the operational annex. I had not expected that. A signals analyst does not expect to be named in an operational annex. But the order required a reader, someone who understood the Vash ledger from the inside, who could stand in the emptied places and confirm against their own records that the accounts were closed and the count was true. That was me. I was the man who had read the debt into existence, and so I was the man who would read the settlement out. I did not refuse. I have thought about whether I should have. I was a quiet man who wanted the numbers to be true, and here was the truest number I would ever handle, and it required my hand. I went. The fleet that assembled to carry out the culling order was not the fleet of the recruiting posters. It was worse than that and better. There was nothing chaotic in it, nothing of rage. It was organized the way an audit is organized. The lead formation was designated the ledger, a deliberate name, chosen by someone who understood exactly what the Vash had done and intended to answer it in its own grammar. And it was built not for glory but for thoroughness. Heavy vessels, methodical, unhurried, carrying between them the capacity to reduce a feeding world's infrastructure to slag, and to disable a Vash host fleet before it could raise a defense, and carrying also in their holds the men and women who would go down onto the emptied worlds and confirm the count. I want to be clear about the shape of it because the shape was the message. This was not a scratch force flung together in anger. The capacity had existed for years. The heavy interdiction vessels, the slag throwers built for reducing hostile orbital industry, the survey and confirmation teams, all of it standing doctrine, all of it established, none of it a miracle pulled from nowhere the moment we needed it. That is the thing people misunderstand about what we did. We did not invent a weapon to answer Meridian Reach. We already had the instrument. What Meridian Reach changed was not our capacity but our willingness to use it, and the culling order was the document that turned the one into the other. The Vash had counted on our reluctance the way they counted on everything else, as a fixed quantity in their favor, a variable that would never move. They had never imagined a value large enough to move it. Meridian Reach was that value. There were no speeches when we mustered. I had half expected them and dreaded them, because a speech would have made it smaller, would have turned the thing into passion, into a story about how angry we were, when the whole terrible weight of it was that we were not angry in any way a speech could carry. There was a briefing instead, cold and complete, held in a gray compartment aboard the ledger's flagship with the operational charts standing in the air between us. It laid out the sequence of worlds, the intake data for each, the expected host fleet dispositions, the rules of engagement, and the confirmation protocol. My protocol, the reading of the count, written into the operation as a formal step, because the order required that no world be closed until its account had been read against the Vash's own records and found true. I sat in that briefing and heard my 4 months of work turned into procedure, and I understood that I was no longer an analyst who had found a thing. I was an instrument the operation would use to make sure it did no more and no less than the account required. At the end of it, the commander of the ledger, a broad, silent man named Halloran Osa, who had lost no one at Meridian and did not need to have, stood in front of the assembled officers and did not raise his voice. He was not a man who raised his voice. He looked at us for a moment, and then he said, "We will do this correctly. We will do all of it. We will not do more than the account requires, and we will not do less. There will be no burning of things that do not need burning. There will be no killing of things that the account does not name. We are not here to make them suffer. We are here to make it stop and to make it never possible again, and those are not the same as making them suffer, and any man who confuses the two will answer to me." He paused. "Read me the count at every world. When the count is closed, we stop." And that was all. No fist, no flag. Just a man promising to keep the books, and promising in the same breath to keep them honestly, which I have come to think was the harder and the more human of the two promises. I understood, standing there, that this was the thing about us the Vash had never bothered to learn. They had studied our defenses and our biology and our replacement rate. They had not studied our patience, because patience in livestock is not a threat. They did not know that a species can grieve slowly and coldly and turn the grief into an instrument. They did not know that we could count, too. The first feeding world was called Oshit Minor in our charts, a Vash holding 2 jumps inside the verge, and it was there I first saw what the ledger meant in the flesh. We came in under a bright, hard sun. I remember being surprised by that. Foolishly, I had imagined these places dark, imagined them lightless the way cruelty is imagined lightless in stories. They were not. Oshit Minor turned under a white daylight, a clean cold star burning down on a green-gray world, and the feeding installation spread across its surface in the daylight like industry, like anything. That was the horror of it, seen plainly. There was nothing hidden. The Vash did not hide what they did because they did not think of it as a thing to hide. The intake station stood in the open sun, ordered, efficient, ringed by the walled enclosures where the provisioning herds were kept, and from orbit in the bright morning light, it looked like farmland. It looked like exactly what it was. I stood at an analysis port and looked down at it and thought that a man could fly over that world 100 times and, not knowing the notation, see nothing but agriculture, see order and prosperity and the calm competence of a going concern, and that this was perhaps the truest thing the Vash had ever taught me. That evil at scale does not look like evil. It looks like management. The ledger disabled the Vash host fleet over Oshit Minor in under an hour. I was on the analysis deck for it, and there was nothing in the operation that resembled a battle as I understood the word. The Vash ships moved to defend and were methodically taken apart, formation by formation, by an enemy that did not hurry and did not gloat and did not waste a shot. Our people had studied the Vash the way the Vash had studied Meridian's locks. The intercepted traffic I and 100 analysts like me had spent years decoding had become fire control solutions and interdiction vectors. The long, quiet work of listening turned at last into consequence. And they opened the alien fleet with the same unbothered competence the Vash had once used on us. I watched it die on the analysis boards as a series of falling numbers. I felt the cold satisfaction of an account beginning to balance, and I was ashamed of the satisfaction, and I felt it anyway. I have stopped being ashamed of it since. A man is allowed to feel the balancing of a true account. What he is not allowed to do is enjoy the cost, and I did not enjoy the cost, and I will hold to that distinction until I die. Then we went down, and the account stopped being numbers. The herds on Oshit Minor were not human. I need to say that because it changes nothing and it changes everything. Meridian Reach was the only human world the Vash held. The ordinate fed on many species, and the enclosures on Oshit Minor held creatures I had no name for: a squat, patient, six-limbed people with soft gray hides and eyes that held something I recognized even across the whole gulf of biology, which was the particular exhaustion of a living thing that has been worked past the edge of endurance for longer than it can remember. They had been provisioned for a very long time. Generations, the ledger said. They did not know how to be free. When we opened the enclosures, they did not run. They stood in the bright daylight in their pens and looked at us and did not understand that the schedule had stopped, because the schedule was the only shape their lives had ever had. One of them, I have never been able to forget this, came to the opened gate and stood at the threshold and did not cross it, and put out one gray hand to where the wall had been, feeling for it, because the wall was the edge of everything it had ever known, and its absence was not freedom to that creature, but only a missing certainty. I stood in the sun and watched a freed thing mourn the wall of its own pen, and I understood for the first time the full dimension of what the Vash did. They did not only take the substance of a body, they took the shape of a life and filled it with the schedule until there was nothing left underneath to be free. I stood in the sun on Oshit Minor with a Vash intake ledger open on my reader, and I confirmed the count. That was my task, and I did it. I read the intake records against the survivors, and I read the losses against the mass graves the survey teams found beyond the enclosures, long orderly trenches. The losses managed even in death with the same tidy efficiency as everything else. And I confirmed, line by terrible line, that the numbers were true, that the Vash had done exactly what their own records said they had done, no more and no less, and that the account was real. And then I read the settlement into the record. The apparatus of the world was emptied. The intake stations were reduced to slag under the noon sun. The Vash caste that ran the operation, the clerks and the drivers and the overseers, all of them wearing the same unbothered competence I had seen in the ledger's every column, none of them able even now to grasp that they had done a wrong rather than suffered a reversal, were removed from the capacity to ever run it again. Not tortured, not made to suffer for suffering's sake. The order was clear on that, and Osai enforced it without mercy in either direction. We did not do more than the account required, but we did all of it. The world was closed. The freed herds we could not save all at once. A people worked for generations does not simply walk into freedom, but we did what the account did not require and could not have forbidden, which was to leave them the world, cleared of its apparatus, and to send word up the chain that they existed and would need help learning to be a people again. Osai signed that himself, off the books, and dared anyone to question it. No one did. We did 9 feeding worlds. I could tell you about each of them, and I will not, because after a certain point the horror does not accumulate, it only repeats, and the repetition is its own kind of truth. But 2 of them I will set down, because they taught me things the others only confirmed. Cavard Hold was the second. The herds there were a slender bird-bone people, tall and hollow-framed, and they had been provisioned so long that when our linguists tried to speak with the few who could still hold a conversation, they found the language had lost the word for a future. Not the concept, the linguist said the word. A people does not misplace a word by accident. A people loses the word for the future when the future stops being a thing that happens to it, when every tomorrow becomes only the next drawing on the schedule, identical to the last, until the grammar itself gives up the tense as useless freight. I sat in on one of those attempted conversations, on a daylit floor in a cleared enclosure, and watched an old bird-bone creature try to understand the question our linguist was asking. What do you hope for, and fail, gently, without distress, the way you fail to answer a question in a language you have never learned. It did not know what hope was for. The Vash had not beaten it out of them. They had simply never left room for it, generation on generation, until it withered from disuse. I confirmed the count on Cavard Hold, and I read the settlement out, and I did it with a steadiness I did not feel, because I had understood by then that the count I was confirming was not only the dead. It was everything the living had been prevented from becoming. That does not fit in a column. I put it in the record anyway in a note of my own, off the protocol, and let it stand. Then the Soon depots, 3 worlds run as a single operation, a model of Vash efficiency, the crown of their administration. Here the intake was so optimized that the ledger tracked yield to the individual body. Not to the herd, not to the enclosure, to the body. Each one entered as a numbered unit with its own intake history, and its own projected replacement curve, and its own retirement date, the date at which the curve flattened and the body ceased to be worth maintaining. I read those individual records on the soon depots. I did not have to. The protocol required the population count, not the individual histories. But I read them, some hundreds of them, standing in the daylight of a vast records hall while the survey teams worked around me, because I had decided somewhere along the campaign that the least I could do, the very least, the floor of what a decent creature owed the dead, was to be one mind that had held them as individuals before the account closed. I read a numbered unit's intake history from first drawing to retirement date, and I understood that I was reading a life, compressed by an alien hand into a yield curve, and that no one in the universe but me would ever read it as anything else. So I read it as a life. I read as many as I could before Osai's timetable moved us on. It was not much. It was what there was. It was over the soon depots that the Vash first tried to speak to us. Not the others. The earlier worlds had simply defended and died. But here, at the heart of their administration, someone finally reached for words. Then Thren and Ashet Prime and the others, each one a farm under a bright, indifferent sun, each one holding a people the Vash had entered into a column and drawn from until the column balanced, each one requiring me to stand in the daylight and confirm the count and read the settlement out. The worlds blur together in memory now, the way the middle of any long ordeal blurs, but the register never changed. We came in daylight. We disabled the host fleet. We went down. We opened the enclosures. I confirmed the count against their own records. We emptied the apparatus and closed the world and left the freed herds whatever future they could still build on ground we had cleared for them. World by world, without hurry, without rage, the instrument doing what the instrument was for. The Vash did not understand what was happening to them. That is the part I have carried the longest. They could see the fleet. They could count their own losses. What they could not do was fit it into any frame they possessed, because their frame had no place in it for the possibility that a herd might have kin. That was the shape of their arrogance, and it was total. They had fed on so many species for so long without consequence that the concept of consequence had atrophied out of them. When the ledger arrived over the soon depots, the Vash administrator broadcast to us not a plea at first but a query, a genuine, uncomprehending query. He wanted to know on whose authority we interfered with a lawful provisioning operation. He used that word, lawful. By what right, he asked, did we disrupt the ordnance inventory? I was the one who answered because I was the reader, and because Osai looked at me and said, "You found it. You tell him." I did not gloat. I want that on the record too, for whatever it is worth. The Vash administrator was not begging. He was, to the last, incapable of understanding that he had done anything a rational universe would object to. And I did not deliver a line. I read him the ledger. His own ledger, the one we had recovered, the one that had started all of it. I read him the Meridian Reach intake schedule, world and quantity and cycle and loss, 9 years of it, in his own notation in his own hand. I read him the first drawing and the first loss. I read him the adjustment made in the 3rd year, when the losses ran high, and the intake was throttled back to preserve the yield. A decision I made him hear as what it was, which was a choice to keep human beings alive not out of any mercy, but because dead ones stopped producing. I read him the replacement rate. I read him the final seasons, the thinning columns, the mild regret noted against the declining yield. I read it all at the pace of an audit in the flattest voice I own, and I did not raise it once, because the flatness was the point, because I was giving back to him, exactly, the register in which he had done the thing, and letting him hear how it sounded when the accounting was read aloud by one of the accounted. And then I told him that the population he had entered into that column had kin, and that the kin had read the column, and that the kin kept books too, and that the account was now being settled in full. He did not understand. I could hear it in the silence that followed, not fear, but a kind of vast confusion, the confusion of a mind encountering, for the first time in its species' long history, the idea that the things it fed upon might do arithmetic of their own. When he spoke again, his tone had not changed. He did not plead. He asked instead a clarifying question, the way a clerk asks a clarifying question about an irregular entry. He wanted to know whether we understood that meridian reach had been provisioned under the ordinate's own law lawfully, by every standard the ordinate recognized. He was not defending himself. He was correcting what he took to be an error in our understanding. He genuinely believed that if we grasped the lawfulness of it, we would see that no debt existed. That was the moment I understood the Vash completely and stopped being angry at them, the way you stop being angry at a flood. There was no one in there to be angry at. There was only a mechanism that had never once been made to feel the pull of another creature's life, and could not now be taught to, and could only be stopped. He asked one more question before the Soon depots were emptied. He asked why we had waited 9 years. I told him the truth. I told him we had not known. I told him that we had grieved Meridian Reach as a colony lost to storms, that we had carved the number into a wall and held our services and mourned in ignorance, and that the day we learned the truth was the day the account came due, and that the 9 years were his, not ours. 9 years he had been drawing on the debt without knowing the creditor would ever read the books. I told him the waiting he was so puzzled by had been his safety, and that it was over. And then Osai closed the world, and I did not speak to a Vash again. We reached Ashet Prime last. It was the seat of the Ordnance Provisioning Administration, the world where the ledgers were kept, and it was fitting in a way that felt almost designed that the account should close where the accounts were held. The Vash made their only real stand there. They had finally understood, in the way a body understands a fever without understanding a disease, that they were being unmade, and they massed what host fleet they had left over Ashet Prime, and they fought. I watched that fight from the analysis deck the way I had watched all the others, and it was different in only one respect. The Vash, for the first time, did not fight like an administration defending an asset. They fought like something afraid. Their formations were ragged where the others had been orderly, their fire wild where the others had been economical, and I realized I was watching a species experience, in its final hours, an emotion it had spent its whole ascendancy declining to feel, the particular animal terror of the thing that has always been the predator, and has just discovered, far too late, that it is not. I took no pleasure in it. I had passed pleasure somewhere back around the Soon depots, but I noted it, the way I noted everything, because it belonged in the record, that the Vash learned fear at the very end and learned it from us, and learned it too late to be anything but a footnote to their own ledger. It was still not a battle in the sense the Vash would have wanted, because we had studied them and they had never troubled to study us, and the outcome of a fight between a party that has done its reading and a party that has assumed it does not need to is not a battle. It is a settlement. It took the ledger a day. We lost people. I do not want to pretend the account was paid only by the other side. Good men and women died over Ashet Prime, and their names are in a record too, and I have read that record as carefully as I read the other one, because a settlement that pretends it cost nothing is a lie, and I had sworn off lies the day I first read the Meridian schedule. But at the end of the day, the sky over Ashet Prime belonged to us, and we went down into the administrative city under a white noon sun, and I walked into the hall where the Vash kept their ledgers, and I found Meridian Reach. The original, the physical record such as their records were physical, a lattice of stored cycles in a cold vault, the master account from which the copy I had decoded had been drawn. I stood in front of it in the daylight that fell through the high windows of that alien hall, and I read the whole of Meridian Reach in the original hand. 240,000 people, entered as a herd on a date I can still recite, drawn on for 9 years. The intake, the losses, the adjustments, the final columns thinning as the herd was worked past its replacement rate in the last seasons, the Vash clerks nodding the declining yield with the mild administrative regret of men watching a mine play out. And at the very end, an entry I had not seen in the copy, a closing note in the master ledger, appended some weeks before we arrived, when the ordinate had finally connected the emptying of its feeding worlds to the human dossier it had by then intercepted. The note was brief. It reclassified meridian reach. It struck the word herd and entered in its place a vast term I had to work at to render, and when I rendered it my hands were not steady. The nearest I can come to it in our language is error. They had not repented. They were not capable of repentance. They had simply at the last revised the entry, reclassified 240,000 murdered human beings not as a wrong done but as a mistake made, a miscalculation of which population it was safe to farm. Even at the end, we were not people to them. We were a bad investment. I read that entry 3 times, the way I had read the first one, in the bright daylight of that dying Empire's central hall. And then I did the last thing the culling order required of me. I read the settlement into the master record. I entered in our notation alongside their reclassification, the closing of the account, every feeding world emptied, every intake station slagged, every herd freed to whatever future it could build, the entire capacity of the Vash ordinate to feed upon the living reduced in the plainest terms I could find to 0. I made the 2 ledgers agree. Theirs said what they had done. Ours said what it had cost them. And between the 2 columns there was, at last, no discrepancy. We did not destroy the Vash. I want to be exact about this because it is the part people always want to be larger than it was. We did not scour their homeworlds or end their species. The order did not require it and Osai did not permit it. What we ended was the thing they had built their existence upon, the assumption that they could feed on the living and pay no price. We emptied every feeding world. We freed every herd we found. We reduced the ordinate from a caste empire that farmed the galaxy's peoples to a scattered, broken thing that would spend whatever centuries it had left knowing, in whatever passed for its bones, that there was a species out in the dark that had been filed as livestock and had answered by reading the ledger back. That knowledge was the settlement. That knowledge stands. I came home to Earth after. There was no parade, which I was grateful for. The campaign had not been the kind of thing you parade. It had been necessary, and it had been right, and it had also been the emptying of 9 worlds, and the closing of a great many accounts that could never truly balance, because the arithmetic of a life does not balance. Not really. Not ever. You can only stop the drawing and free what is left and refuse to let it happen again, and call that justice, because there is no larger word available. I had done my part of it, and I had come home changed in a way I did not have language for at first. I had gone out a man who wanted the numbers to be true. I came back a man who had learned what a true number costs to read aloud, and to whom, and how a voice must stay flat to carry it, and what that flatness takes out of the man who holds it. I do not regret any of it, but I did not come home whole, and I have never pretended to, and the men who tell you a thing like this can be done and leave you whole are lying, usually to make it easier to ask you to do it again. I went to the wall where they had carved the number for meridian reached 9 years before, back when we thought it was storms, and I stood in front of it in the ordinary daylight of an ordinary afternoon, and I did not weep, because the weeping was long done, filed away years before with the rest of the grief, converted into the instrument that had carried me across 9 worlds. I looked at the number, 240,000. I thought about the traffic I had read once and filed under nothing, the school being built, the request for a second physician, the small durable business of people who meant to stay. I thought about the old bird-boned creature on Cavard Hold that did not have a word for the future, and about the numbered units on the soon depots that I had read as lives because no one else ever would, and about the gray hand feeling for the wall of an opened pen. And I thought that all of it, every world of it, had come out of this number on this wall, this one specific offense read correctly and answered in full, that the whole campaign had been, in the end, nothing more than 240,000 people refusing to be a rounding error in someone else's book. Below the number, the city had added a new line in the years I was gone, once the truth came home, not a longer number, not a boast, just a plain sentence in plain letters, and I have thought since that whoever chose those words understood the whole of it better than any speech could have. The line reads, "They were not a herd, they were ours, the count is closed." I am an old man now, and I still sort noise for a living, in a quieter office on a quieter deck, and most days the noise is only noise. But sometimes, out past the sable verge, a burst comes through in a notation I have not heard in years, a fragment of vast traffic from one of the scattered remnants, and I read it out of long habit before I can stop myself. It is never a threat. They do not make threats anymore. It is usually only the ordinary circulatory traffic of a broken thing keeping itself alive. But once, a few years ago, a fragment came through that I have kept, that I read now and then when the office is empty and the daylight is going gray in the windows. It was a Vash inventory notation, one of their old provisioning forms, the exact template I had first decoded on the Ataris a lifetime ago. But the entry was blank. Where the species classification should have gone, where a Vash clerk would once have written herd or yield or provisioning holding without a moment's thought, there was nothing, a blank field, an account left unopened. I have decided to believe that means they learned. Not repentance, they were never capable of that, but arithmetic. Somewhere in the scattered remnant of the ordinate, a Vash clerk sat with a blank provisioning form and a species he might once have entered as a herd, and did not enter it, because the last time the ordinate did that arithmetic, the answer came for every feeding world they owned, and the creditor read the ledger back in their own hand, and the account did not close until it was true. It is a cold thing to hope for, that a predator abstains not from mercy but from calculation. But I have made my peace with cold things. Mercy would have been better. Mercy was never on offer from the Vash, not for the six-limbed people of Oshit Minor, not for the bird-boned herds of Cavard Hold, not for the numbered units of the Soon depots, and not for the 240,000 of Meridian Reach. Calculation was all we could put into them. So calculation is what I hope took root. Let them abstain out of arithmetic. Arithmetic, at least, does not forget. That is the whole of it. That is what I found and what we did and why. We did not rage. We are not, whatever they believed, a species that rages well. We grieve slowly. We file the grief. We keep books. And when the account is real, we settle it in full, world by world, in daylight, without hurry, not because we hate, but because we counted, and the count was ours, and the count is closed. Do not enter us in the ledger. That is the only warning we have ever needed to give, and we gave it once, and it stands.